Ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor now to open the next session of our special webcast and symposium here in London. We have with us today a Pugwashite and a friend. We are very honored to have with us Dr. Al-Shahristani. He's going to be talking about fighting against weapons of mass destruction and extremism in the Middle East. He's going to talk about his personal journey and the regional imperatives for these issues. As you know, this is Pugwash's celebration of the 20th anniversary of its Nobel Peace Prize, and we could think of no one out there in the world who would be more appropriate to join us here in this place to talk about those very issues that motivated the founders of our organization. Many of them were people who put their own personal careers and their own personal livelihoods on the line to try to take a moral stance against nuclear weapons. And Dr. Al-Shahristani himself is a current example of someone who has lived by those ideals and who continues to bring scientific knowledge and moral conviction into his current political role. He is the quintessential Pugwashite in that respect. A little bit of background for those of you who might not be familiar with his extensive CV. I'm only going to hit some highlights. I've asked other participants today to describe themselves, but I suspect that Dr. Al-Shahristani, being the humble man that I know he is, might not mention some of these points, so I will do that from here. He is currently the Minister for Higher Education in Iraq, and he served previously in several different governmental posts, including as Deputy Prime Minister for Energy Affairs, Minister of Oil, a member of the Iraqi Parliament, and as first Deputy Chairman of the Iraqi National Assembly. He's been a professor at Baghdad University and a visiting professor at Surrey University in the UK. He's a former head of the Iraqi National Academy of Sciences. Dr. Al-Shahristani spent more than a decade as a political prisoner in Abu Ghraib. It's under the regime of Saddam Hussein for his refusal to work on nuclear weapons program. He was first arrested for his opposition to the government's persecution of political opponents, and then he was kept captive for his refusal to work on the nuclear weapons. He escaped during a bombing raid on Baghdad during the first Gulf War, and he's had a long journey since then, and I hope he will explain to us some of those various experiences today, and most certainly the perspectives that he has learned through a lifetime of commitment to these sorts of issues. In 2012, he was the laureate of the Freedom from Fear Award, and that was an appropriately given award. We're very honored to have you here with us today. And following Dr. Al-Shahristani's presentation, his keynote address, then we'll have comment from Reem Turkmani, who is a Syrian astrophysicist who has founded a group, an NGO that supports Syrian civil society. She is a fellow, a research fellow at LSE and a former Hodgkins fellow at the Royal Society. So we're in good company today to be guided through this discussion of some of the most important issues our societies are facing today. Dr. Al-Shahristani, please.
I would like to start by thanking the UK Pugwash group for organizing this meeting. And it is a great privilege to be asked to speak to such distinguished audience at such prestigious institute, the Royal Society, on weapons of mass destruction and terrorism. Today we are here to commemorate the 20th anniversary of awarding the Nobel Prize for Peace to Pugwash and Rotblat for their tireless efforts to raise awareness to the threat of nuclear weapons to humanity at large. We should also recall that this is the year, this year is the 17th anniversary of dropping nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and 60th anniversary of Russell Einstein Manifesto, calling upon the international community to eliminate nuclear weapons and renounce war. Personally, I am humbled to speak about my own journey, but that is what I was asked to do. In December 1979, I had to make a choice, either to work for Saddam on developing weapon of mass destruction, his nuclear program, or to pay a price. The choice was simple, and the price turned out to be reasonable, only 11 years and 3 months in prison. When I made that choice, it did not cross my mind that I would explain my decision to such a distinguished audience. Then I was more concerned with how to explain myself to my interrogators. When I explained to Saddam's head of security, this was Saddam's half-brother, Barazan Tikriti, that my scientific training was not in the field of bomb making, he forcefully told me that it is a man's duty to serve his country, and those who do not abide by this precept do not deserve to be alive. I nodded that I agreed that it is a person's duty to serve his or her country. But I had a different understanding of what constituted a service to my country. I was then taken to solitary confinement, where I was to remain for 10 years. My understanding then and now is that weapons of mass destruction do not provide any country with unchallenged security. On the contrary, these weapons set off an arms race that not only make the country more insecure, but also endanger the world at large. For me, the issue is also ethical. I believe there are more responsibilities that scientists must adhere to, particularly there are moral responsibilities that scientists must adhere to, particularly in this dangerous era of weapons of mass destruction. Science and technology have been affecting the lives of all people in the world. Scientists have been revered for their contribution to the expansion of frontiers of knowledge and for improving the quality of life for many on this planet. Our generation is thus the custodian of the tirelessly earned recognition, respect, and authority accrued by many generations of scientists. Our duty as scientists is to ensure that our discoveries and achievements are used for the benefit of mankind, to improve the quality of life of as many people as possible, to prevent further damage to the environment, to find means to regenerate our planet and make life sustainable for human beings, and all our co-inhabitants on Earth. Our meaningful survival depends upon these traditional ideals of science. I would like to salute from this podium all those who have contributed to achieving the historic agreement in Paris last week on protecting the planet from excessive emission of carbon dioxide that has led to global warming. The scrupulous implementation of what was agreed upon by all countries is vital if we were to succeed to arrest the global warming. Returning to the anniversary that we are celebrating, Pugwash has played an important role in directing attention to the dangers that the nuclear weapons constitute to our planet, and its efforts were recognized by awarding it the Nobel Prize for Peace. The threat of these weapons has greatly diminished in recent years, particularly after the accord on the Iranian nuclear program. We must commend Iran and its interlocutors, the International Atomic Energy Agency and the Group of 5+1, for this historic achievement, and would like to appeal to them all from this platform to implement the agreement in full and in good faith. This is a goal that Pugwash should pursue with vigilance and persistence. There is no region in the world now as volatile as the Middle East. And presently, the security environment is seriously challenged by many negative factors. The rise of Daesh, impasse of the Palestinian peace process, growing political instability, and the threat of weapons of mass destruction. This situation represents a serious threat to both the Middle Eastern countries and the rest of the world. The terrorist attacks in Paris and California can be repeated anytime in any city in the world. The urgency for elimination of all weapons of mass destruction from the region cannot be overemphasized. The United Nations has recognized this situation, and the Security Council passed a resolution over 4 decades ago, in 1974, calling for nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East. Ever since then, the Council has passed a resolution almost every year, calling or reaffirming its resolution on this issue. We have heard from Patricia Lewis how the numerous meetings and detailed discussions have basically led nowhere so far, unfortunately. The failure of this year's review conference for the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty to produce consensus document with any substance was due to disagreement on the process and timing of a conference to establish a nuclear weapon-free zone in the Middle East. Israel refuses to join NPT and be part of the free zone in the Middle East. And it is bewildering that some Western countries justify that stance. If the Iranian nuclear program was the reason for such sympathy in the past, there is no excuse after the accord with Iran. Also, we cannot overlook the threat of other forms of weapons of mass destruction, like nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons, offer little or no demonstrable political or security benefit to those who possess them. Such weapons in Syria, Iraq under Saddam, and Libya under Gaddafi, and in Israel, have failed to prevent military confrontation or even regime changes. Elimination of these weapons must remain a prime goal if we endeavor to save humanity and the environment. Additional risk of keeping weapons of mass destruction is that they may fall in the hands of terrorists. We have already witnessed the use of chemical weapons by terrorist groups in Iraq and in Syria. In Iraq, Daesh used mustard gas on a couple of occasions in the north and chlorine barrels in the battles in central Iraq. In Syria, although the regime has conceded to the removal of its stockpile of chemical weapons by the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, insurgents have managed to access nerve gases and other chemicals and have already used them on more than one occasion. Now, I would like to turn to terrorism as a new tool of mass destruction with the rise of Daesh. In this presentation, I'll be using the word Daesh to refer to the entity that calls itself the State of Islamic Caliphate, or more commonly known as ISIS or ISIL. I find this necessary because calling it Islamic is a linguistic trap intended to make us unintentionally become part of the game that the organization endeavors to divide the world into Muslims and non-Muslims entrenched against each other. Historically, Daesh is an offshoot of Al-Qaeda. The Syrian civil war, which started in March 2011, has breathed new life into jihadi militancy, providing an unprecedented wave of recruits for Daesh. Currently, it controls significant territories in northeastern Syria and northwestern Iraq, and has nominal control over small areas in Libya, Nigeria, Yemen, and Afghanistan. The organization has also sleeping cells in more than 50 countries in the world. It is a potent danger to many societies, as was amply demonstrated in the Paris attacks. In the last year and a half, Daesh carried out 83 attacks in 20 countries, other than Syria and Iraq, killing about 1,600 people. In Syria, and Iraq, Daesh now commands about 30,000 foreign fighters from more than 80 countries. Almost an equal number of locals from both countries have joined them. More than 5,000 individuals traveled from Europe to the region to join Daesh. The biggest numbers came from the largest European countries, France, Germany, and Britain. But in relation to population size, Belgium is far the highest. About 10% of them are females, and 20% of the European fighters are citizens of non-migrant origins. Turkey is the gateway for these terrorists to Syria and from Syria to Iraq. The ideology adhered to by Daesh is extreme interpretation of Islam that was advocated by Wahhabi zealots in Arabian desert in the mid-18th century, that denounced traditional Islamic practices and considered the overwhelming majority of Muslims as infidels or false believers, contesting the traditional diversity and the pluralism of Islam. The spread of Wahhabism in the last 4 decades in some Muslim countries and among Muslim immigrant communities in the West was funded by petrodollars to gain legitimization and political influence for some Gulf regimes. Daesh uses extreme brutality in its campaigns, including mass slaughters, beheadings, burning prisoners alive, or throwing them down from high buildings. They also carry out public mass executions, use rape as weapon of war, trade girls for as sex slaves, and have been responsible for genocides against Shia Muslims, Christians, and Yazidis. However, the majority of their victims nowadays are Sunni Muslims whom they claim to defend. It is noteworthy that they deploy the most sophisticated propaganda tactics in the history of terrorism. With the help of social media, online video and chat services, video graphics, and special effects, Daesh is just a click away from being able to reach potential recruits that are actually far beyond its geographic reach. I would like now to ponder on the causes of this phenomenon and what can we do collectively to face this challenge to our humanity. The root causes of radicalism, violence, and terrorism among youth in particular, in the name of religion, are very complex. There is a combination of various factors, including politics, economics, and teaching extremism in the name of religion. In most cases, politics seems to be the most important factor. The nature and level of political exclusion, perceived injustice, lack of social cohesion, and unfair distribution of national wealth collectively build the levels of resentment in the marginalized populations, particularly among the deprived youth, the unemployed poor, and the minorities. Absence of effective platforms for these resentments to be expressed and grievances to be addressed leads to a buildup of feeling of injustice, and such communities become fertile ground for recruitment of terrorists. The civil war in Syria served as an attraction point for militant jihadis. At the beginning, they came to help the rebels in their struggle against the Syrian regime. With the rise of Daesh, many others poured in with the illusion of establishing a just caliphate. Daesh quickly overran territories held by other rebel groups and captured the city of Mosul and large areas in northern Iraq. It engaged in skirmishes with Al-Qaeda-affiliated Nusra Front and other insurgent groups. All these groups have established links to some power centers in the region where they get arms, funding, and logistical assistance. The aerial bombardment carried out by Western coalition against Daesh bases and economic lifelines is very useful, but not sufficient. In order to defeat Daesh and the other extremist groups, the closure of borders from Turkey is essential to cut off logistical supply routes. Not less important is ending financial support from some rich Arab countries in the Gulf. US Vice President Joe Biden said in an unscripted question and answer session with students at Harvard University on 2nd of October 2014, quote, "Our allies in the region are our largest problem." He argued that Turkey, the Saudis, Qatar, the Emirates were so determined to take down Assad that they poured hundreds of millions of dollars and tens of thousands of weapons, tens of thousands of tons of weapons onto anybody who would fight against him, except that the people who were being supplied were al-Nusra and Al-Qaeda, and the extremist elements of jihadis coming from other parts of the world. The recent Russian military involvement has added another dimension to the conflict, and it's becoming more evident that there is no military solution to this conflict. The longer it takes for the parties to the conflict to sit together under UN auspices to reach peaceful solution to their political differences that can address the deep resentment of segments of the Syrian people and the mistrust among Syrian communities, the more blood would be shed, alas, mostly by innocent people, to reach the same conclusion. Also, we cannot overlook the historical sectarian divisions among Muslim nations in many countries. These differences have recently been stirred up for political expediency, particularly in countries where minority sect rules over majority, such as in Syria, Bahrain, or Iraq under Saddam. Regrettably, these sectarian divisions have been cultivated by some actors in the Middle East to redirect attention from their own political and social problems. So what can we do? Having discussed the threat Daesh presents to humanity, let us ponder what our joint responsibility to this challenge is. First, the world should realize that Daesh is a real threat to all, and not just a brutal terrorist group. The world should not have waited for 2 years until Western cities were targeted to recognize the seriousness of this threat and to consider the need for joint response. Daesh should be fought at a global, regional, and local levels, not only in Iraq and Syria, but in all the 100 countries where new jihadis are recruited. The responsibility to dry the roots that have given rise to Muslim extremism lies primarily with the Muslims themselves. First, there is an urgent need for Muslim scholars to rethink, reform, and reinterpret certain classical and medieval texts about jihad. For that purpose, the scholars and Muslims in general must irrevocably condemn any act of terrorism under any banner and for any cause. Patriotic struggle for just causes does not require terrorist acts. Wahhabi schools, mosques, and religious centers in the Muslim countries and within Muslim communities in the rest of the world are the main breeding grounds for such radical rejectionist ideology that is in complete contrast to the traditional diversity and pluralism of Islam. A young 10-year-old child attending a meeting at a mosque here in London was asked what he wants to be when he grows up. His response was that he wants to become a terrorist. Our children deserve better education than what they get at such schools. I call on all education authorities to carefully monitor what is being taught in private schools that are funded by some Gulf charities. This brings us to the funding of Daesh and its main source of finance. An international terrorist organization with tens of thousands of recruits and even larger numbers of supporters worldwide, carrying out various activities, propagating their extreme ideology, running their well-conducted media campaigns, infiltrating Muslim communities, and reaching out to marginalized groups require a scale of funding not available to typical terrorist groups. Daesh finances its activities from several sources. The most important are crude oil sales, donations mostly from Gulf organizations and individuals, sales of archaeological articles, and taxes collected from local shops, traders, and farmers. Their total annual revenue is estimated to reach more than $1 billion from these sources. However, their main need for military equipment is covered by supplies received indirectly, I repeat, indirectly, from regional actors or captured from rebels in Syria who are supplied with such military hardware from regional powers. The main crude oil production that Daesh trades is from oil fields in Syria and Iraq, where production is about 45,000 barrels a day, generating some $500 million a year. Crude oil is smuggled out across Syrian and Iraqi borders to Turkey. Hundreds of trucks transport crude oil across these borders every day through a smuggling network that cannot be outside the sight of the watchful eye of security and intelligence agencies. Attacking trucks en route to Turkish borders by Russian and US bombers is a welcome development, which should have taken place since the first aerial bombardment started a year ago. Donations from non-governmental organizations in Gulf countries are the second major revenue source of funding of these terrorist groups. Amounts vary from one terrorist group to another, but in total, it is estimated that a few hundred of millions of dollars reach from such so-called charity groups in these countries. Blocking financial lifeline of Daesh and other terrorist groups is paramount to weaken them. A much stricter control on bank transfers from suspected charity organizations and cash transfers across borders to Syria and Iraq is needed. Even more important than choking financial lifeline of extremist groups is draining their recruitment grounds. Engagement of marginalized and frustrated communities by developing national policies to absorb them in the larger community and addressing the issues that agitate them is absolutely essential to deprive the terrorists from recruiting new volunteers. Monitoring mosques, schools, social centers, and NGOs that promote extremist ideologies and fertile grounds for recruitment of would-be jihadists is very important, but often overlooked under the pretext of freedom of belief. Terrorism has become a major threat to security and order of the 21st century, and it demands a more deliberative and effective response. Terrorist groups can reach every corner of the globe, taking advantage of the interconnected international systems of communication, banking, and transport. No state on its own can deal with transnational terrorism, and there is a great need for international coordination rather than cooperation to overcome this threat. I would like to end this presentation by reporting what we are doing in Iraq to fight Daesh. When Daesh overrun large areas in northern Iraq in June 2014, the Iraqi military units in Mosul collapsed, and the invading Daesh militia advanced in a few days all the way down to Samarra, a holy city 100 kilometers north of Baghdad. At this juncture, Ayatollah Sistani from Najaf called on Iraqi people to defend their country and protect the people. Thousands of Iraqis immediately responded to the call and volunteered to form popular mobilization. The total number of these units is now about 50,000, and they are highly motivated and deeply committed to fighting Daesh alongside the Iraqi armed forces. So far, about 100,000 square kilometers have been recaptured from Daesh in central Iraq. To Iraqis, the human cost so far has been 13,000 dead and about 25,000 injured. Most of them were killed in mass executions of captured soldiers in the initial wave of attack, and civilians who have resisted occupation of their towns, particularly in the Anbar province in western Iraq. And these were almost all Sunni communities who have fought back. Most of the injuries were due to car and suicide bomb attacks in crowded areas. Despite these great losses, Iraqis would not stop fighting Daesh until every square meter of their homeland is freed and their brethren are liberated. However, the world would not be safer until the organization is totally dismantled and its recruiting routes and financial lifelines are choked. Syria, Libya, and Yemen would remain attraction fields for Daesh and the like, unless peaceful resolutions for the conflicts are reached and people can return to their norm of life in peace, dignity, and mutual respect. This would be difficult to attain without involvement and encouragement of the international community. The meetings in Vienna of the International Syria Support Group earlier this year, where all foreign actors and supporters of various fighting groups in Syria have agreed to work together to propose a roadmap for peaceful resolution of the conflict, was a good starting point, although much belated. The coming meeting of ISSG next month, where representatives of the fighting factions other than Daesh and Nusra Front will join in, is an exceptional opportunity that should not be allowed to slip away without agreement on implementation of the roadmap proposed by the ISSG to set up a government of national unity that is tasked with drafting a new constitution for Syria and holding elections under UN auspices within the next 18 months as planned. Pugwash should stand ready, as it has always been, to help reach such a transition to pluralistic, inclusive, democratic, and progressive form of government in Syria and elsewhere. Peaceful resolution of the Syrian crisis would pave the way to similar solutions in Libya and Yemen. This is our best way of defeating Daesh. Thank you.
Our time is short, and it's difficult to have a discussion fully on the very important and insightful comments that we've just heard from the minister. Because of being driven by technology today, we have to conclude at 1:30, because that's when our webcast ends. But of course, our dialogue is going to continue amongst those present with us here in London in the afternoon. We are going now, we don't have time for questions. What we're going to do is we've asked another scientist from the region, Reem Turkmani, to offer some comments, and these are informed comments based on her extensive experience, trying to bring some reason to bear on these issues as well. So Reem, we have about 12 minutes or so, and then we'll have a final word from Paolo, and then we'll conclude. Thank you, Reem.
Thank you very much, and thank you for a wonderful speech. It's very difficult to follow and too much to comment on. Like you, I grew up also in a country with a dictatorship in place, and the dictatorship that was also trying to develop weapon of mass destruction, but a chemical weapon. But I was more lucky than you because I managed to escape that trap early. I wanted to study physics in Syria. I so much wanted to do physics. And when I finished my high school and I told my father that I want to study physics, it was like there's two ways in Syria to do physics. You either go to the high level of, the High Institute of Research known as the Markaz al-Buhuth, which is where you really become a scientist, so you really get a proper training, you get sent to France, the government invests heavily on you, or you go to the university where you end up as a high school teacher. There's no research tradition there. The number one choice was for me completely out of question, because this is where the chemical weapon have developed. This is the institute that the state have invested in, and some Western countries, unfortunately, also helped putting up together and training the scientists. This is the institute that was trying to turn potential Syrian scientists into makers of weapons of mass destruction. So you get pampered by the state, you get paid high salaries, offered houses, and everything, but you have to contribute to these crimes. So I tried to avoid that, but then the alternative for me was actually I couldn't go to the other university, so I studied engineering because it was a much better university in Damascus, with the promise from my family that if I finish my undergrad in Syria, I then go abroad and study what I want. So I finished the engineering. I did electronics engineering in Damascus University. And then when I finished, I applied for a master in Sweden in physics. So I went back to the thing that I wanted to do, and indeed I took my master, then PhD in physics in Sweden. When I was writing my PhD thesis, Tony Blair and Bush decided they want to invade Iraq, and that was kind of what really the event of the year back in 2003. I was in St. Andrews. I was doing a year of my PhD there, and most of my time I was campaigning against the war. For me, I think the biggest thing we have to stop and end and prevent is war in order to prevent extremism. This is how you end ISIS. I mean, one day of attack in Paris, just one day, led to the rise of the extreme right in France. Can you imagine decades of war in Iraq and Syria? What do they create? Dividing the society in Iraq into winners and losers, the resentment that was developed, that is now feeding into ISIS. We know that many of the ISIS leaders are actually Ba'athist, or they used to serve under, they were officials under Saddam. That's what we helped creating by waging war. Same thing applies in Syria. The biggest problem in Syria is the war. We have to end the war. And there is war because there is no political legitimacy, because this regime is illegitimate. It had no popular legitimacy, no constitutional legitimacy even. But the way to change that, the regime, not for other countries to come and say that the president should step down and turn what was a public uprising for democracy and human rights, to turn it into a regime change agenda, when you can't even impose that regime change. That changed the dynamic, and that came more as a Western agenda rather than a Syrian agenda for change. Indeed, the uprising unfortunately turned into war. Lots of money was thrown into it. Lots of external intervention helped accelerate this war. Money that was sent from abroad, weapons that were sent. And the EU, unfortunately, was one of the players that helped accelerating this when they lifted the sanctions on the Syrian oil just as it fell down under the control of extreme groups, 2013. Very shortly, just as they lifted the ban on the sanction of buying the Syrian oil, they accelerated the fight over these oil wells. And very quickly, Jabhat al-Nusra, which is Al-Qaeda-associated group, got hold of these oil wells. And this is the group that became ISIS. This is how it started in Syria, the control of the oil. So going back to it, I think I respect all what you said about how ISIS is benefiting from the war in Syria, but we have to also work on addressing the root of political legitimacy. We have to support the legitimate rising groups, the civil society, the local administrative council. The legitimacy comes from within the country. It doesn't come from abroad. We can't sit here and assign an exile opposition as legitimate actor and then invite them to sit on negotiation table and expect to come up with a solution that will end the Syrian crisis. I did research. I mean, I'm a scientist, and I was astrophysicist until very recently. I was a research fellow of the Royal Society. But unfortunately, with the acceleration of events in Syria and what was an uprising turned into a war, I just switched off. I just couldn't do science anymore. And I decided that now I want to invest all my knowledge into trying to resolve this conflict. So, strange enough, I joined the LSE, London School of Economic and Political Science. I think I'm the first astrophysicist to join the LSE. And I'm working on really using, because as astrophysicist, I was trained into understanding complexity, model complexity, and do cross-scale coupling. And this is what I do now with the LSE. I work with political scientists and economists in understanding the complexity of the war in Syria, and how do you match the bottom-up processes with the top-down? How do you put a peace process in place that really addresses the root of the crisis? So I'm doing my best in kind of mixing science, diplomacy, and Pugwash was the excellent platform for me to do so, and they have helped me a lot as well in starting some track to processes that actually led to some local development in Syria. And thank you very much for that. But one of the papers I did actually on Syria addressed the issues you were talking about how this war feeds into terrorism. Particularly, I'll talk a little bit about Syria, because what we noticed is, and that's different with ISIS, with the other groups, is that ISIS feeds particularly on the collapse of state. So the war in Syria led to the collapse of state. Any contested land, any land that was fought between the opposition and the regime, witnessed the collapse of state. And notice that the ISIS did not take any area except Palmyra from the regime directly. Because despite everything, the regime areas were better controlled. When the state collapsed, there is absolute chaos. There is no one to restore the state institutions, to bring back governance. So ISIS comes in, immediately restore all of that and reverse the process and behave like a pseudo-state. They have a very strong governance system, very strong. They present a comprehensive package of how you have the political package with the governance, with the armed, with the services, everything. And they don't accept that anyone else have arms but them. They bring knowledge and strategic thinking. That's what they think, and that's what they bring in. And that's what we need now as Syrians and in the Middle East in general from the West. We need the knowledge, how to rebuild governance. That's what we need, the strategic thinking. We don't need more war. We need to end the existing war, reverse the process, and bring legitimacy back. What we learned also in Syria, I respect the emphasis on the weapon of mass destruction, but when it was used in Syria, and one day it killed about maybe 2,000 people, but now every week or two in Syria, the same number of people are being killed. So we have to bring the emphasis back on this different, new type of wars that are devolving in the region. It's not just the state-to-state war where the weapon of mass destructions are being used. More than 500,000 people have died in Syria. Not just the people we hear about in the news. There are more than 200 people died because of the collapse of healthcare. We don't hear about those people.
Reem, I'm going to have to ask you just to wrap up quickly,
Sure.
because we're about to lose the webcast, and I just want to,
Sure.
perhaps if, maybe the way to do this would be if I could just say now, in case we cut out in 2 minutes with the webcast, that this session and this day has proven beyond doubt that those goals, visions, dreams, imperatives of the founders of Pugwash, the authors of the Russell Einstein, the signers of the Russell Einstein Manifesto 60 years ago, the wishes and dreams that were put in place when the Pugwash Nobel Peace Prize was awarded 20 years ago, which is what we're here to commemorate. You know, they were all about the social responsibility of scientists, the need to avoid the dangers and eliminate weapons of mass destruction, and they're about the need to abolish war. And our speakers today, in particular, Dr. Al-Shahristani and also Reem, have proven that those goals and missions are alive and well, and people are working to meet those goals all over the world in many different ways. So Paolo would like to have...
No, I just want to
Yes.
hear the end of the...
Yeah, unfortunately, we're cutting out of a
I just want
webcast
to end
right
by
now.
just supporting your call to support the roadmap that will come out of this Vienna process. But what we really want from the international organization, international community, is to bring civil society to the table. True. Because right now, what came out of the Vienna process is the Riyadh process that only had the exile opposition and the armed groups on the top. So the first thing they all agreed to drop is accountability and justice. And without accountability, without justice, there will be no permanent peace in Syria. Because as you said, the roots is the grievance that is there. So we need, it's only civil society that fights for the rights of the victims from all sides will be able to carry such an important, extremely crucial portfolio. So we do count on your support to bring back accountability and justice to any roadmap for peace in Syria.
And it will be not easy.
I know.
What I would like to suggest we do right now, Paolo, is we conclude the webcast. If you want to say a final word before the webcast concludes, and maybe with the indulgence of our speakers, we can sit here for a few more minutes into the lunch session, but we do have to conclude the webcast. Paolo, would you like to?
Just one sentence. I mean, it's... First of all, we thank all the speakers and all the... I think it's very clear that we are dealing with complicated issues, and it's really important to understand, discuss, and try to find new ways. So the problem we are facing is very extremely serious, and it connects with what has been always the problem of Pugwash, dealing with the complexity of war and try to solve this. And conclusion is that we have to work more.
Good.
Thank you, everybody, and with this we'll conclude the webcast.